In a world where reactions are often instantaneous and emotions flare up at the slightest provocation, it's easy to feel like we are constantly on the defensive. Words, actions, and even the mere presence of others can spark a storm of anger, hurt, or frustration. But what if there were a way to free ourselves from this cycle of offense? What if we could train our minds to rise above the provocations of the world, to respond with grace instead of reacting with bitterness? This is where Stoicism, an ancient philosophy that has withstood the test of time, offers profound wisdom. Stoicism teaches that offense is not something that happens to us, but something we allow to happen within us. By shifting our thinking and embracing a new perspective on life, we can learn how to never be offended again. This journey will explore how Stoic principles can liberate you from emotional suffering, empowering you to live a life of inner peace and resilience. You wake up one morning, check your phone, and see a message that immediately makes your blood boil. Maybe it's a comment on social media that seems to attack your beliefs. Perhaps it's a text from a family member that feels dismissive of something important to you. Or it could be an email from a colleague that strikes you as condescending. Within seconds, your peaceful morning has transformed into a storm of indignation, anger, and hurt. Sound familiar? If you're honest with yourself, this scenario probably plays out more often than you'd like to admit. But here's what I want you to consider. What if I told you that the power to be offended doesn't actually lie in those words, actions, or situations? What if the entire experience of offense is something you're creating, moment by moment, through a series of mental habits you've never questioned? This isn't about victim blaming or suggesting that harmful actions don't exist in the world. Rather, it's about recognizing a profound truth that the ancient Stoic philosophers understood over 2,000 years ago. The events themselves are neutral. It's our interpretation, our reaction, our internal narrative about these events that creates our suffering. Epictetus, a former slave who became one of history's most influential philosophers, captured this perfectly when he said, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." Think about the weight of that statement. He's suggesting that between any external event and your emotional response lies a space, a crucial gap where your power resides. Consider this. Two people can witness the exact same event and have completely different emotional experiences. One person hears criticism and feels devastated. Another hears the same words and feels curious about the perspective being offered. One person encounters rudeness and spends the day fuming. Another encounters identical rudeness and feels compassion for someone who must be struggling to act that way. The external stimulus is identical, but the internal experience is worlds apart. This reveals something extraordinary about the nature of offense itself. Offense isn't actually contained in words, actions, or events. It's a mental construct, a story we tell ourselves about what something means, particularly what it means about us. When someone says something we find offensive, we're not really responding to their words alone. We're responding to our interpretation of their words, filtered through our expectations, our insecurities, our past experiences, and our beliefs about how we should be treated. Let me share a story that illustrates this perfectly. Sarah, a marketing professional, attended a company meeting where her boss publicly questioned one of her recent campaign strategies. Her immediate reaction was intense offense. She felt humiliated, disrespected, and angry. She spent the rest of the day ruminating about the interaction, crafting imaginary responses, and feeling increasingly resentful. But here's what's fascinating. Her colleague Michael was in the same meeting, heard the same comments, and had an entirely different experience. He saw a boss who was under pressure, trying to understand a complex situation and asking legitimate questions about strategy. Michael didn't take anything personally because he understood that the boss's questions weren't about him as a person. They were about finding the best path forward for the company. Same event, same words, completely different emotional experiences. This difference didn't occur because Michael was somehow less sensitive or because he didn't care about his work. It occurred because Michael had internalized a crucial Stoic insight. External events don't carry inherent emotional meaning. We assign that meaning through our interpretations. The Stoics understood that we live in two worlds simultaneously, the world of external events and the world of our judgments about those events. External events simply are what they are. A person says certain words, an action occurs, a situation unfolds. These are just facts, neutral, objective realities that exist independent of our emotional responses to them. But then we immediately begin the process of interpretation. We decide what these events mean. We determine whether they're good or bad, whether they reflect on us personally, whether they match our expectations, whether they threaten our sense of self. This interpretation happens so quickly that we often don't realize it's happening at all. We assume our emotional reaction is a direct result of the external event, when in reality it's a result of our mental processing of that event. This recognition is both humbling and empowering. It's humbling because it forces us to acknowledge that our emotional suffering often comes from our own mental habits rather than from external circumstances. We can no longer simply blame the world for our emotional state. But it's empowering because it reveals that we have far more control over our emotional experience than we typically realize. When you truly understand that offense is a choice, not a conscious choice necessarily, but a choice nonetheless, you begin to see the possibility of making different choices. You start to recognize that the feeling of being offended is actually a signal that you're giving external events power over your internal state. It's a red flag indicating that you've forgotten one of the most fundamental truths about human experience. You always have the ability to choose your response. This doesn't mean you have to become emotionally numb or indifferent to everything around you. The Stoics weren't advocating for a life devoid of feeling. Rather, they were pointing toward a life where your emotional responses serve you rather than enslave you. They understood that when you base your peace of mind on external events aligning with your preferences, you become a victim of circumstances beyond your control. The root of offense, then, lies in our fundamental misunderstanding about where our emotional experience comes from. We've been taught to believe that certain words, actions, or situations automatically create certain feelings. But this is an illusion. The feelings are created by our thoughts about those words, actions, or situations. And thoughts, unlike external events, are within our domain of influence. As we continue this journey together, we'll explore how to exercise this influence more consciously and skillfully. But for now, simply recognizing that offense is something you participate in creating is the first step toward freedom. It's the beginning of reclaiming your emotional sovereignty and discovering that peace of mind isn't dependent on the world behaving according to your preferences. Imagine you're driving down the highway when another car suddenly cuts you off, forcing you to brake hard. Your immediate response might be anger. Perhaps you honk your horn, mutter under your breath, or spend the next few minutes fuming about inconsiderate drivers. But what if, in that same moment, you noticed an ambulance racing ahead in the distance? Suddenly, your entire interpretation shifts. That inconsiderate driver might be a parent rushing to the hospital where their child is in emergency surgery. Your anger transforms into understanding, maybe even compassion. Nothing changed about the external event. A car still cut you off, but everything changed about your emotional experience. This is the power of reframing, and it's one of the most practical and transformative tools the Stoics offer us for dealing with offensive situations. Marcus Aurelius, perhaps history's most powerful practitioner of Stoicism, mastered this art of reframing. As Roman emperor, he constantly faced criticism, betrayal, and challenges to his authority. Yet his personal writings, which we know today as meditations, reveal a man who consistently chose to interpret events in ways that served his peace of mind rather than his ego. In one passage he writes, "How much trouble he avoids who does not look to see what his neighbor says or does, but only to what he does himself." Aurelius understood that the stories we tell ourselves about other people's actions are often more damaging than the actions themselves. He practiced reframing not as a form of denial, but as a form of wisdom. Reframing isn't about pretending that hurtful actions don't exist or that all behavior is acceptable. It's about recognizing that you always have multiple ways to interpret any situation, and some interpretations serve your well-being better than others. It's about choosing the interpretation that empowers you rather than victimizes you. Consider the last time someone said something that offended you deeply. In that moment, you probably focused on one particular interpretation of their words, perhaps that they were attacking you personally, disrespecting you, or trying to hurt you. But were there other possible interpretations you didn't consider? Could they have been speaking from their own pain? Might they have been poorly expressing a legitimate concern? Were they perhaps dealing with stress you weren't aware of? I'm not suggesting you should excuse harmful behavior or allow people to treat you poorly. Boundaries are important, and sometimes direct action is necessary. But I am suggesting that you have more power over your emotional response than you typically exercise, and that power lies in your ability to choose how you frame the situation. Let me share another story. David worked for a company where his manager, Janet, frequently made comments that felt dismissive and undermining. For months, David interpreted these interactions as personal attacks. He assumed Janet didn't respect him, was trying to sabotage his career, or simply didn't like him. These interpretations generated constant stress, resentment, and anxiety about going to work. Then David had a conversation with a colleague who had worked with Janet for several years. The colleague explained that Janet had grown up in a family where direct, sometimes harsh feedback was considered helpful and caring. She genuinely believed she was helping people improve by pointing out their mistakes immediately and clearly. She had no idea her communication style was causing distress. Armed with this new perspective, David began reframing his interactions with Janet. Instead of interpreting her comments as attacks, he started viewing them as awkward attempts to help him succeed. This shift didn't change Janet's behavior, but it completely transformed David's emotional experience. He stopped taking her comments personally, began focusing on any useful information they contained, and found ways to communicate his own needs more effectively. The ancient Stoics developed specific techniques for this kind of reframing. One of the most powerful is what they called the view from above. Imagining yourself from a broader perspective, perhaps looking down from a great height or forward from the distant future. When you're feeling offended by someone's comment on social media, try viewing the situation from the perspective of someone looking back on this moment 100 years from now. How significant will this interaction seem? How much of your precious mental energy is it worth? Another Stoic technique involves asking yourself, what would I think about this situation if it were happening to someone else? Often we extend far more compassion and understanding to others than we do to ourselves. When a friend tells us about someone being rude to them, we might immediately suggest alternative explanations. Maybe they were having a bad day, or they probably didn't mean it personally. Yet, when the same thing happens to us, we jump to the most negative interpretation possible. The practice of reframing also involves recognizing that offense often says more about our own internal state than about external events. When we're feeling secure, confident, and centered, we're much less likely to interpret ambiguous situations negatively. When we're feeling insecure, stressed, or vulnerable, we're more likely to perceive threats and slights everywhere. This awareness can be incredibly liberating. If you notice yourself getting offended frequently, it might be a signal that you need to attend to your own emotional well-being rather than trying to control everyone else's behavior. Perhaps you need more rest, better boundaries, supportive relationships, or simply more self-compassion. Marcus Aurelius captured this beautifully when he wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." Realize this, and you will find strength. Reframing is how you exercise that power. It's how you reclaim your emotional freedom from the tyranny of other people's words and actions. But reframing isn't always easy, especially when you're in the heat of an emotional reaction. It requires practice, patience, and a willingness to question your immediate assumptions. Start small. The next time you feel a mild irritation or offense, pause and ask yourself, what's another way I could interpret this situation? What if the person had positive intentions? What if this has nothing to do with me personally? As you develop this skill, you'll discover something remarkable. The world doesn't actually change, but your experience of the world transforms dramatically. You'll find yourself less reactive, more resilient, and ultimately more free. Because when you realize you can choose how to frame any situation, you realize that your peace of mind is truly in your own hands. Deep within your mind lives a fierce guardian, your ego. It's always on duty, constantly scanning your environment for threats to your identity, your worth, your sense of self. When someone criticizes your work, questions your intelligence, or dismisses your opinions, this guardian sounds the alarm. Red alert. Your sense of self is under attack. Defend. Counterattack. Be offended. But here's what's fascinating about this internal security system. It's protecting something that isn't actually real in the way you think it is. The self that feels so threatened, so solid, so important to defend, is largely a collection of stories, beliefs, and identities that you've accumulated over time. And understanding this psychological reality is crucial to freeing yourself from the cycle of offense. Modern psychology has revealed something the Stoics intuitively understood. Offense is rarely about the present moment. It's about the intersection between external events and your internal psychological landscape, your fears, insecurities, past wounds, and the image you've built of who you think you are. Think about the last time someone said something that really got under your skin. If you examine that moment honestly, you'll probably discover that your reaction wasn't just about their words. It was about what those words seemed to say about you. Maybe they triggered a fear that you're not smart enough, successful enough, or worthy of respect. Perhaps they reminded you of a painful experience from your past, or challenged an identity that's important to your sense of self. Dr. Sarah Chen, a therapist I know, shared a powerful insight with me. She said that in her practice, she's noticed that people who get offended most easily are often those who are most uncertain about themselves in the very areas where they feel attacked. The successful business owner who gets furious when someone questions his intelligence might secretly worry that he's not as smart as people think. The parent who becomes enraged when someone criticizes their parenting might harbor deep insecurities about whether they're doing a good job raising their children. This isn't to shame anyone for having insecurities. We all have them. It's to illuminate how offense often functions as a psychological defense mechanism. When someone's words hit close to a fear or insecurity you carry, your mind interprets this as a genuine threat and activates your fight or flight response. Suddenly, you're not just hearing words anymore. You're experiencing a perceived attack on your very identity. The Stoics understood this dynamic intimately, though they described it in different terms. Epictetus taught that we suffer not from events themselves, but from our judgments about events. What modern psychology helps us understand is that these judgments are heavily influenced by our unconscious beliefs about ourselves and our place in the world. Consider the concept of cognitive biases, the systematic ways our minds distort information to fit our existing beliefs and protect our sense of self. When someone says something that could be interpreted multiple ways, we often unconsciously select the interpretation that confirms our existing fears or insecurities. If you believe deep down that people don't respect you, you'll tend to interpret ambiguous comments as disrespectful, even when that wasn't the speaker's intention. There's also the psychological phenomenon known as emotional reasoning, the tendency to assume that because you feel something strongly, it must be true. If someone's comment makes you feel disrespected, your mind concludes that you were, in fact, disrespected. But feelings, while valid as experiences, aren't necessarily accurate reflections of external reality. They're often more accurate reflections of your internal psychological state. Let me tell you about Maria, a talented graphic designer who consistently felt offended by feedback from clients. Every suggestion for revision felt like a personal attack. Every request for changes seemed to imply that her work wasn't good enough. She spent enormous amounts of energy feeling hurt and defensive, which made it difficult for her to actually improve her work or build positive relationships with clients. Through therapy, Maria discovered that her sensitivity to feedback was rooted in childhood experiences with a highly critical parent who had made her feel like nothing she did was ever good enough. As an adult, any suggestion for improvement triggered that old wound and the fear that she was fundamentally inadequate. Once she understood this connection, she could begin to separate her present moment experiences from her historical pain. The reactive mind, the part of us that gets triggered and responds emotionally, operates much faster than the rational mind. Neuroscientists have shown that emotional reactions can occur within milliseconds, while rational thought takes longer to engage. This means that by the time you're consciously aware of feeling offended, your brain has already interpreted the situation, activated stress hormones, and prepared your body for conflict. But here's the empowering part. While you can't control those initial reactions, you can learn to recognize them and engage your rational mind more quickly. You can develop what psychologists call emotional intelligence, the ability to observe your emotional responses with some distance and choose how to act on them. The Stoics practiced a similar skill through what they called prososche, continuous attention to the present moment and to your mental processes. Marcus Aurelius regularly reminded himself to observe his thoughts and reactions rather than being completely identified with them. He understood that there's a difference between having a thought or feeling and being consumed by it. One of the most liberating realizations you can have is that your thoughts and feelings are not you, They're experiences you're having. When someone says something that triggers offense, you can learn to notice the feeling arising without immediately acting on it. You can observe the stories your mind starts telling about what this means, without automatically believing those stories. This doesn't mean suppressing or denying your emotions. Suppression actually tends to make emotions stronger and more persistent. Instead, it means developing the capacity to feel your feelings while also maintaining some perspective on them. You can acknowledge that you feel hurt or angry while also recognizing that these feelings are based on your interpretation of events, not on the inherent meaning of those events. The goal isn't to become emotionally numb or to never feel hurt. The goal is to respond from a place of choice rather than compulsion, wisdom rather than reactivity. When you understand the psychological mechanisms behind offense, you gain the power to work with those mechanisms rather than being controlled by them. As we move deeper into this exploration, remember that this understanding is itself a form of freedom. Every moment you spend observing your mental processes rather than being completely lost in them is a moment of increased consciousness and choice. And choice, as we'll continue to discover, is where your real power lies. Picture this. You're sitting in a beautiful garden, feeling completely at peace. The sun is warm on your face, birds are singing, and everything feels perfect. Suddenly, storm clouds roll in, wind begins to howl, and rain starts pouring down. Does the garden's beauty disappear? Does its essential nature change? Or do only the temporary conditions change while something deeper remains constant? This metaphor captures one of the most profound insights of Stoic philosophy. There's a part of you that remains untouchable by external circumstances, no matter how turbulent they become. The Stoics called this your inner citadel, a place within you that no outside force can penetrate unless you open the gates yourself. Marcus Aurelius, writing in his personal journal during military campaigns and political turmoil, captured this truth perfectly. Nothing can hurt you without your permission. Think about the radical implications of this statement. He's not suggesting that external events can't cause physical harm or create challenging circumstances. He's pointing to something much deeper. The recognition that your essential well-being, your inner peace, your sense of self-worth don't have to be dependent on external conditions. The Stoics made a crucial distinction that most of us have never learned to make clearly: the difference between what's up to us and what's not up to us. This might sound overly simple, but this distinction is actually one of the most sophisticated psychological insights ever developed. Everything that causes offense falls into the not up to us category. Other people's words, actions, opinions, and behaviors. Everything that determines your response falls into the up to us category, your thoughts, judgments, values, and choices. When you really understand this distinction, something remarkable happens. You stop trying to control the uncontrollable and start focusing your energy on what you actually can influence. You realize that spending your precious mental energy trying to make other people behave the way you want them to is like trying to control the weather, exhausting and ultimately futile. Let me share a story that illustrates this beautifully. James was a high school teacher who felt constantly offended by his students' behavior. They were disrespectful, unmotivated, and seemed to deliberately try to push his buttons. He spent enormous amounts of energy feeling frustrated, angry, and personally attacked by their attitudes and actions. One day, a colleague asked him a simple question. What if their behavior has absolutely nothing to do with you? This question stopped James in his tracks. He began to consider that his students' attitudes might be influenced by factors completely outside his awareness: family problems, social pressures, learning difficulties, or simply the normal challenges of adolescence. More importantly, he began to recognize that his primary job wasn't to control his students' attitudes. It was to control his own response to their attitudes. He could choose to take their behavior personally, or he could choose to see it as information about where they were in their development. He could choose to let their disrespect ruin his day, or he could choose to maintain his own sense of purpose and dignity regardless of how they behaved. This shift didn't make his students suddenly become respectful and motivated, but it completely transformed James's experience of teaching. He stopped feeling victimized by their behavior and started feeling empowered to respond skillfully. He became more creative in his teaching methods, more patient with their limitations, and more focused on what he could actually control: his own preparation, attitude, and responses. The Stoics practiced an exercise called premeditatio malorum, imagining potential difficulties before they occur. This wasn't pessimism or negative thinking, it was emotional preparation. By mentally rehearsing how they would respond to various challenges, they developed resilience and reduced the shock value of difficult experiences. You can practice this with situations that typically offend you. If you know you're going to interact with someone who often says things that trigger you, spend a few minutes beforehand imagining different scenarios and how you want to respond. Not how you typically react, but how you want to respond, from a place of wisdom rather than reactivity. Imagine that person making their usual cutting remarks. Instead of feeling the familiar surge of anger or hurt, picture yourself remaining calm and centered. Visualize yourself recognizing that their words say more about their internal state than about your worth. See yourself choosing your response consciously rather than reacting automatically. This kind of mental preparation isn't about becoming passive or accepting mistreatment. It's about ensuring that your responses come from your highest self rather than your wounded ego. When you're prepared mentally and emotionally, you can address inappropriate behavior more effectively because you're not clouded by personal offense. The Stoics also understood that our emotional reactions often stem from unrealistic expectations about how the world should operate. We expect people to be more considerate than they are, more aware than they are, more skillful than they are. When reality doesn't match our expectations, we feel offended, as if the universe has somehow broken a promise to us. But what if you approached each day with more realistic expectations? What if you expected some people to be inconsiderate, some interactions to be difficult, some situations to be frustrating? This isn't cynicism, it's wisdom. When you expect perfection from an imperfect world, you set yourself up for constant disappointment. When you expect imperfection and are pleasantly surprised by kindness and consideration, you create space for gratitude and joy. The practice of emotional self-sufficiency doesn't mean becoming isolated or indifferent to others. It means developing such a strong sense of your own worth and purpose that external events can't knock you off course. It means cultivating inner resources, wisdom, compassion, humor, perspective that you can draw upon regardless of external circumstances. Think of yourself as a tree with deep roots. Surface storms, other people's moods, comments, or behaviors might shake your branches, but they can't uproot you. Your stability comes from your connection to something deeper than the passing weather of daily interactions. When you truly internalize this understanding, offense becomes much less frequent and much less intense. You begin to see that most of what people say and do is really about them, their fears, their pain, their limitations, their perspectives, rather than about you. You stop taking everything personally because you realize that very little actually is personal. This doesn't mean becoming callous or uncaring. In fact, when you're not constantly feeling attacked by others' behavior, you often become more compassionate. You can see their struggles more clearly because you're not viewing everything through the lens of how it affects you. The external world will continue to be unpredictable, challenging, and sometimes harsh. But your inner world can remain a sanctuary of peace, wisdom, and strength. This is the promise of Stoic philosophy. Not that life will become easy, but that you can become unshakable. There's a moment in every person's life when they glimpse the truth about their ego. That small, insistent voice that constantly narrates their experience with one central theme. What does this mean about me? It's the voice that turns neutral events into personal dramas, innocent comments into attacks on your character, and everyday interactions into tests of your worth. Your ego isn't evil or wrong. It's simply a psychological mechanism that developed to help you navigate social situations and maintain a sense of identity. But when it becomes your primary lens for interpreting reality, it turns you into a prisoner of other people's words and actions. Every interaction becomes an opportunity to either inflate or deflate your sense of self. Every comment becomes a referendum on your value as a person. The Stoics understood that this identification with ego was the root of almost all psychological suffering. When Epictetus said, "No one can hurt you without your permission," he was pointing to a profound truth. The only thing that can truly be damaged by external events is your ego story about who you are. Your essential self, your capacity for wisdom, love, growth, and contribution remains untouchable. But here's what makes ego identification so insidious. It feels completely real and justified in the moment. When someone criticizes your work, it genuinely feels like they're attacking you personally. When someone disagrees with your opinion, it truly seems like they're dismissing your intelligence. When someone doesn't respond to your message quickly, it authentically appears that they don't value your relationship. Let me tell you about Michael, a successful architect who came to understand this dynamic through a painful but ultimately liberating experience. For years, Michael's sense of self-worth was intimately tied to his professional reputation. Every project was an extension of his identity. Every client interaction felt like a judgment of his value as a person. One day, a particularly demanding client not only rejected his design proposal, but did so in a way that felt personally attacking. "This is amateur work," the client said. "I expected much better from someone with your supposed reputation." Michael felt devastated. He spent days replaying the interaction, feeling angry, hurt, and questioning his abilities. But then something shifted. In the depths of his emotional reaction, Michael had a realization. The client's words could only hurt him because he had made his professional work identical to his personal worth. He had forgotten that he was a human being who happened to be an architect, not an architect who happened to be a human being. This distinction might seem subtle, but it's actually revolutionary. When you identify completely with your roles, professional, social, family, you become vulnerable to any threat to those roles. But when you recognize that you are something deeper than your roles, something more essential than your achievements or failures, you create space between external events and your inner peace. The Stoics practiced what they called the discipline of desire, learning to want what happens rather than demanding that what happens conform to your preferences. This doesn't mean becoming passive or accepting harmful situations. It means recognizing that your happiness and peace of mind don't depend on the world constantly validating your ego's preferences. Think about the last time you felt deeply offended. If you examine that experience carefully, you'll probably discover that beneath the offense was a story your ego was telling about what the situation meant about you. Maybe the story was, if they really respected me, they wouldn't have said that. Or, a person of my status deserves better treatment. Or, after everything I've done for them, this is how they treat me. These stories aren't necessarily untrue, but they're also not necessarily the only way to interpret the situation. And more importantly, they're not worth your peace of mind. The Stoics understood that you can acknowledge unfair treatment without letting it disturb your inner equilibrium. You can recognize disrespect without taking it personally. You can address inappropriate behavior without making it about your worth as a person. One of the most powerful practices for developing ego detachment is what I call the observer self. Throughout your day, try to notice the voice in your head that's constantly evaluating, judging, and making everything about you. This isn't about stopping that voice. That's probably impossible. It's about recognizing that you are not that voice. You are the awareness that can observe that voice. When someone says something that triggers your ego, try to catch yourself in the act. Notice the immediate story your mind creates. They're trying to make me look bad. They don't respect me. They think they're better than me. Then remind yourself, that's my ego talking. What would I think about this situation if it weren't about me at all? This practice of disidentification is incredibly liberating because it reveals that most of your emotional suffering comes not from external events, but from your ego's interpretation of those events. When you stop taking everything personally, you discover that very little actually is personal. Most people are simply trying to navigate their own lives, deal with their own challenges, and manage their own emotions. Their words and actions usually have much more to do with their internal state than with any deliberate intention to affect you. Marcus Aurelius captured this beautifully when he wrote, "How much trouble he avoids who does not look to see what his neighbor says or does, but only to what he does himself." He understood that constantly monitoring other people's behavior for signs of disrespect or offense is exhausting and ultimately pointless. Your energy is much better spent on cultivating your own character and wisdom. But ego detachment doesn't mean becoming emotionally numb or indifferent to feedback. Healthy detachment actually allows you to receive feedback more clearly because you're not filtering it through the ego's need to protect itself. When someone offers criticism, instead of immediately feeling defensive, you can ask yourself, is there something useful here that could help me grow? Similarly, detachment doesn't mean having no preferences or never standing up for yourself. It means holding your preferences lightly and standing up for yourself from a place of strength rather than wounded ego. There's a world of difference between saying, "I don't appreciate being spoken to that way," from a place of calm dignity, and saying the same words from a place of hurt pride and defensive anger. The goal isn't to eliminate the ego entirely. That's probably neither possible nor desirable. The goal is to have a healthier relationship with it, to recognize it as one voice among many, rather than the ultimate authority on your worth and well-being. When you achieve this kind of detachment, you discover something remarkable. You can engage fully with life without being at the mercy of every external circumstance. As we conclude this first act of our journey, Remember that understanding these concepts intellectually is just the beginning. The real transformation happens through practice, through repeatedly choosing wisdom over reactivity, perspective over personalization, inner peace over ego protection. In the next act, we'll explore how to build these new mental habits and integrate them into your daily life. But for now, simply recognizing that offense is optional, that it's something you participate in creating rather than something that happens to you, is a profound first step toward freedom. You are not your ego. You are not your roles. You are not other people's opinions of you. You are something much more essential, much more resilient, and much more valuable than any external circumstance could ever diminish. There's a sacred pause that exists between every stimulus and every response, a brief moment where your freedom lies. In that pause, you have the power to choose who you want to be in any given situation. Most people live their entire lives without ever discovering this pause, reacting automatically to whatever life throws at them. But once you learn to find and expand this space, you discover one of the most transformative skills human beings can develop: the art of non-reactivity. Picture two people standing in the same line at a busy coffee shop when someone cuts in front of them. The first person immediately feels their blood pressure spike, mutters angrily under their breath, and spends the next 10 minutes fuming about the inconsiderate behavior. The second person notices the same event, feels a brief flash of irritation, but then pauses. In that pause, they make a conscious choice about how to respond. Perhaps they simply let it go, recognizing that getting upset won't change anything and will only poison their own morning. Maybe they politely point out that there's a line. Either way, they respond rather than react. The difference between these two approaches isn't just about coffee shop etiquette. It's about the fundamental difference between living life as a conscious choice maker versus living as a victim of your own automatic responses. The Stoics understood that this capacity to pause and choose your response is perhaps the most essential human freedom. Epictetus, who knew firsthand what it meant to have his external freedom restricted, taught that even in the most constrained circumstances, we retain the power to choose our internal response. Between stimulus and response, there is a space, he essentially taught. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. But developing this capacity for non-reactivity isn't easy, especially in our current cultural moment. We live in a time that seems designed to trigger reactive responses. Social media notifications demand immediate reactions. News cycles create a constant sense of urgency. Our culture often celebrates quick, emotional responses and labels thoughtful pauses as weakness or indecision. Let me share the story of Elena, a customer service manager who discovered the transformative power of non-reactivity through a particularly challenging situation. Elena worked for a company that had recently made some unpopular policy changes, and she found herself on the receiving end of angry customer calls all day long. Initially, she took each complaint personally, feeling defensive and stressed by the constant criticism. One particularly difficult day, a customer called and launched into a vicious personal attack on Elena, questioning her competence, her intelligence, and even making cruel comments about her accent. Elena's immediate impulse was to hang up or defend herself aggressively, but something made her pause. In that moment, she remembered reading about Stoic philosophy and the idea that other people's behavior says more about them than about you. Instead of reacting defensively, Elena took a deep breath and listened. Really listened. Beneath the anger and personal attacks, she heard something else. Fear, frustration, and genuine concern about a policy change that was affecting this person's life. When the customer finished venting, Elena responded with compassion. "I can hear how frustrated and worried you are about this change. Let me see what options we have to address your specific situation." The customer was so surprised by Elena's non-reactive response that they immediately shifted their tone. What could have been a destructive interaction became a productive conversation. But more importantly for Elena, she discovered that she had the power to remain centered and professional even when facing direct personal attacks. She realized that other people's behavior didn't have to determine her internal state. The Stoics taught that reactivity is essentially a form of slavery. You become a puppet whose strings are pulled by external events and other people's behavior. Non-reactivity, on the other hand, is a form of freedom. When you can pause before responding, you reclaim your agency. You stop being at the mercy of every trigger and start living from a place of conscious choice. But non-reactivity doesn't mean becoming passive or emotionally numb. The goal isn't to stop feeling emotions or to avoid taking action when action is needed. The goal is to feel your emotions without being controlled by them and to take action from a place of wisdom rather than reactivity. Marcus Aurelius demonstrated this beautifully in how he handled criticism and betrayal during his reign as emperor. His personal writings show that he felt hurt, anger, and frustration just like anyone else. But he also developed the capacity to observe these emotions without being consumed by them. He would write things like, "I notice I'm feeling angry about this situation. What can I learn from this anger? How can I respond in a way that serves the greater good?" One of the most practical ways to develop non-reactivity is through what I call the pause practice. When you notice yourself becoming triggered, feeling angry, offended, or defensive, try to insert a deliberate pause before responding. This might be as simple as taking 3 deep breaths, counting to 10, or excusing yourself to think for a moment. During this pause, ask yourself some clarifying questions. What am I feeling right now? What story am I telling myself about this situation? Is this story definitely true? How do I want to respond from my best self? What response would I be proud of tomorrow? These questions aren't meant to talk you out of your feelings or convince you that you're wrong to be upset. They're designed to create space between your initial emotional reaction and your chosen response. Sometimes you might decide that your initial reaction was appropriate and that strong action is needed. Other times, you might realize that your reaction was disproportionate to the actual situation. Another powerful practice is what the Stoics called objective representation, describing situations to yourself in purely factual terms without emotional interpretation. Instead of thinking, "He insulted me," you might think, "He said specific words." Instead of, "She's trying to make me look bad," you might think, "She disagreed with my proposal in front of others." This practice of objective representation isn't about denying your emotional experience. It's about separating facts from interpretations so you can see situations more clearly. Often, when we strip away our emotional interpretations, we discover that the factual situation is much less threatening than our story about the situation. The development of non-reactivity also requires understanding the physiology of emotional reactions. When you feel triggered, your body activates the stress response system. Your heart rate increases, stress hormones are released, and your thinking becomes more limited and reactive. This is a natural biological response, but it's not one you have to obey blindly. Learning to recognize the physical signs of reactivity, tension in your shoulders, shallow breathing, a racing heart, can serve as an early warning system. When you notice these signs, you can consciously engage practices that activate your parasympathetic nervous system, slow, deep breathing, relaxing your muscles, or even just remembering that this feeling will pass. The beautiful thing about developing non-reactivity is that it creates a positive feedback loop. The more you practice pausing and choosing your responses, the more confident you become in your ability to handle difficult situations. This confidence, in turn, makes you less likely to feel threatened by challenging interactions, which makes it easier to remain non-reactive. Over time, you begin to discover that most situations that used to trigger intense reactions aren't actually as significant as they initially seemed. You develop what the Stoics called preferred indifference. You might prefer that people treat you with respect, but you're not dependent on their respect for your inner peace. Non-reactivity also has a profound impact on your relationships. When you stop reacting defensively to criticism, people feel safer being honest with you. When you don't take others' bad moods personally, you can offer support rather than taking offense. When you respond thoughtfully rather than reactively, you model a way of being that often inspires others to become less reactive themselves. As we continue this journey into Stoic practice, remember that non-reactivity is a skill that develops over time. Don't expect to master it immediately, and don't judge yourself harshly when you find yourself reacting automatically. Each moment of awareness, each conscious pause, each thoughtful response is a step toward greater freedom and inner peace. The art of non-reactivity isn't about becoming a stone-faced robot who never feels anything. It's about becoming a conscious human being who feels deeply but chooses wisely, who experiences emotions fully but isn't enslaved by them. It's about discovering that you have far more power over your experience of life than you ever imagined possible. There's a profound difference between resignation and acceptance, though many people confuse the two. Resignation is passive, defeated, and often bitter. It's giving up with resentment. Acceptance, particularly the kind the Stoics advocated, is active, empowered, and ultimately liberating. It's not about giving up, it's about giving in to reality so completely that you can work with it rather than against it. The Stoic practice of acceptance begins with a simple but revolutionary recognition. Reality is exactly as it is, regardless of your preferences about how it should be. This moment, this situation, this interaction, it's already happened or is happening. No amount of mental resistance, emotional upset, or wishful thinking can change what is. But here's the paradox that the Stoics understood. When you stop fighting reality, you actually gain more power to influence what happens next. Consider the ancient story of the farmer whose horse ran away. His neighbors said, "How terrible." The farmer replied, "Maybe." The next day, the horse returned with 3 wild horses. The neighbors said, "How wonderful." The farmer said, "Maybe." The farmer's son tried to ride one of the wild horses and broke his leg. "How awful," said the neighbors. "Maybe," said the farmer. The next day, soldiers came to recruit young men for war, but they didn't take the farmer's son because of his broken leg. "How fortunate," said the neighbors. "Maybe," said the farmer. This story illustrates the Stoic understanding that we rarely know whether events are ultimately good or bad for us. What appears to be a disaster might lead to an unexpected opportunity. What seems like good fortune might create unforeseen problems. Given this uncertainty, the Stoics concluded that the wisest approach is to accept what happens without immediately labeling it as positive or negative, and instead focus on how to respond skillfully to whatever arises. Let me tell you about David, a software engineer who discovered the transformative power of acceptance through a career setback that initially felt devastating. David had been working toward a promotion for over 2 years, consistently receiving positive feedback and assurances from his manager that the promotion was just a matter of time. When the position finally opened up, David was passed over in favor of an external candidate with less experience. David's initial reaction was intense anger and a deep sense of betrayal. He spent weeks feeling offended by what he perceived as unfair treatment. He replayed conversations with his manager, looking for evidence of deception. He considered quitting, filing complaints, or finding ways to prove that a mistake had been made. His anger and resentment consumed enormous amounts of mental energy and made him miserable to be around. But gradually, David began to practice Stoic acceptance. He started by acknowledging a simple truth. The decision had been made. No amount of anger or analysis could change what had already occurred. This wasn't resignation. He wasn't happy about the situation, but he stopped wasting energy fighting a reality that had already crystallized. With this acceptance came clarity. David could see his options more objectively. He could learn from the experience and improve his candidacy for future opportunities. He could look for positions elsewhere, or he could find ways to grow in his current role. He realized that his anger and sense of offense had been preventing him from taking any productive action. Interestingly, once David stopped fighting the situation and started working with it, unexpected opportunities emerged. The external candidate who got the promotion struggled with the company culture and left after 6 months. David, who had spent that time focused on improving his skills rather than nursing resentment, was the obvious choice for the role. More importantly, the experience had taught him resilience and given him confidence that he could handle professional disappointments without being derailed by them. The Stoics taught that suffering comes not from events themselves, but from our resistance to events. When you argue with reality, thinking things should be different than they are, you create internal conflict and emotional turbulence. When you accept reality as it is, you create internal peace and the mental clarity needed to respond effectively. This doesn't mean you should accept harmful situations passively, or that you shouldn't work to improve circumstances when possible. Acceptance is about acknowledging what is, not about abandoning all efforts to create change. In fact, acceptance often makes effective action more likely because you're working from a clear understanding of the actual situation rather than from wishful thinking about how things should be. Marcus Aurelius captured this beautifully when he wrote, "Accept the things to which fate binds you, and love the people with whom fate associates you." He understood that acceptance isn't just about tolerating difficult circumstances, it's about finding a way to embrace your entire experience of life, including the parts that don't match your preferences. This kind of radical acceptance has a surprising effect on offense. When someone says something hurtful to you, instead of immediately resisting the reality of what they've said, they shouldn't have said that. How dare they? That's not fair. You can practice accepting that they did in fact say it. This doesn't mean agreeing with them or approving of their behavior. It means acknowledging the reality that these words were spoken. This interaction occurred. This is what happened. From this place of acceptance, you can respond more skillfully. You might choose to address the inappropriate behavior directly. You might decide the person isn't worth engaging with, or you might look for any useful feedback hidden within the hurtful words. But you're making these choices from a place of clarity rather than from a place of resistance and emotional reactivity. One of the most powerful aspects of Stoic acceptance is how it transforms your relationship with other people's behavior. Instead of constantly judging whether others are acting as they should, you begin to accept that people act according to their current level of understanding, their emotional state, their past experiences, and their psychological makeup. This doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it helps you stop taking others' actions as personal affronts. The practice of acceptance also involves accepting yourself, your emotions, your limitations, your mistakes, and your humanity. When you feel offended, instead of judging yourself for having that reaction, you can accept that offense arose. When you make a mistake, instead of spiraling into self-criticism, you can accept that mistakes are part of the human experience and focus on learning from the situation. There's a Stoic exercise called the view from above that can help cultivate acceptance. Imagine looking at your current situation from a great height, perhaps from space, looking down at Earth. From this perspective, your immediate concerns and offenses appear much smaller. This isn't meant to minimize genuine problems, but to provide perspective on what actually deserves your emotional energy. Another powerful practice is asking yourself, what if this situation is exactly what I need for my growth right now? This question doesn't require you to be grateful for difficult circumstances, but it invites you to consider that challenges might serve a purpose in your development. Often, the experiences that initially seem most unwelcome turn out to be the most instructive. The Stoics also taught amor fati, love of fate. This is the ultimate level of acceptance, not just tolerating what happens, but actively embracing your entire life experience as necessary and valuable. This might seem like an impossible ideal, but it points toward a profound truth. When you stop wasting energy fighting reality, you have much more energy available for living fully and responding wisely to whatever arises. Acceptance doesn't happen overnight, especially when you're dealing with genuinely difficult or painful situations. It's a practice that deepens over time. Start small. Practice accepting minor inconveniences and everyday disappointments. Notice how it feels to say, "This is what's happening right now," instead of, "This shouldn't be happening." As you develop this capacity for acceptance, you'll discover something remarkable. Peace is always available to you, regardless of external circumstances. You don't have to wait for life to meet your preferences to experience inner calm. You don't have to wait for other people to behave appropriately to feel centered. Acceptance is the key that unlocks this inner sanctuary, and once you find it, you realize it was always there, waiting for you to stop fighting long enough to notice it. Imagine a tree that has weathered countless storms. Its trunk is thick and strong, its roots run deep, and its branches have learned to bend without breaking. This tree didn't become resilient by avoiding storms, quite the opposite. Each wind that tested it, each harsh season it endured, contributed to its strength. The Stoics understood that emotional resilience works the same way. It's built not by avoiding challenges, but by meeting them with wisdom and courage. Emotional resilience isn't about becoming unfeeling or invulnerable. It's about developing the capacity to experience difficult emotions without being overwhelmed by them, to face setbacks without being defeated, and to encounter offense without losing your inner equilibrium. It's the difference between being a rigid tree that snaps in strong winds and being a flexible tree that bends and then returns to its natural position. The Stoics had a radical perspective on adversity. They saw it as a gift. not a pleasant gift, but a necessary one. Seneca wrote, "Every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end." He understood that challenges, including the experience of being offended or hurt, are opportunities to practice wisdom, develop character, and build inner strength. Let me share the story of Maria, a small business owner who discovered the truth of this Stoic teaching through a series of professional and personal setbacks. Maria had built a successful consulting firm over several years, but then the economy shifted, key clients pulled their contracts, and she faced the possibility of losing everything she had worked to create. Initially, Maria felt not just financially threatened, but personally devastated. The failure of her business felt like a failure of her identity. She took every client departure as a personal rejection, every financial struggle as evidence of her inadequacy. The stress was affecting her health, her relationships, and her ability to think clearly about solutions. But gradually, Maria began to apply Stoic principles to her situation. Instead of seeing the setbacks as purely negative events that shouldn't be happening, she started viewing them as intense training for emotional and practical resilience. She began to ask different questions. What is this situation teaching me? How can I use this challenge to become stronger and wiser? What aspects of this difficulty can I learn from? This shift in perspective didn't immediately solve Maria's business problems, but it dramatically changed her experience of dealing with them. She stopped wasting emotional energy on feeling victimized by circumstances and started channeling that energy into creative problem solving. She began to see each setback as information rather than as a personal attack. When a potential client chose a competitor, instead of feeling offended, she asked for feedback about how she could improve her proposals. Over time, Maria not only rebuilt her business, but created something stronger and more sustainable than before. More importantly, she had developed a level of emotional resilience that made her less vulnerable to future setbacks. She had learned to separate her sense of self-worth from external outcomes and to view challenges as opportunities for growth rather than threats to her identity. The Stoics taught that resilience is built through what they called spiritual exercises, practices designed to strengthen your mental and emotional capacities. One of the most powerful of these exercises is negative visualization, or premeditatio malorum. This involves regularly imagining potential losses or setbacks, not to become pessimistic, but to build psychological preparedness and to cultivate gratitude for what you currently have. When you mentally rehearse how you would handle various forms of offense or disappointment, you develop emotional antibodies. If someone actually does criticize you harshly, you're not caught off guard because you've already considered how you would respond to such a situation. You've practiced maintaining your dignity and perspective in the face of challenging circumstances. Another crucial aspect of building resilience is learning to reframe adversity as training. Athletes understand this principle instinctively. They know that muscles grow stronger by being challenged, not by being kept comfortable. The same principle applies to emotional strength. Each time you choose wisdom over reactivity, perspective over offense, growth over victimhood, you're building psychological muscle. Marcus Aurelius demonstrated this approach throughout his writings. Despite facing plagues, wars, betrayals, and constant criticism, he consistently reframed these challenges as opportunities to practice virtue. He wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." He understood that obstacles aren't just things to overcome, they're the very means by which we develop strength and wisdom. Building resilience also requires developing what psychologists call distress tolerance, the ability to experience difficult emotions without immediately trying to escape from them or being overwhelmed by them. Most people have a very low tolerance for discomfort, especially emotional discomfort. When they feel offended, hurt, or disappointed, they immediately look for ways to make the feeling go away. Blame others, seek revenge, distract themselves, or try to control external circumstances. But the Stoics understood that emotional discomfort, like physical discomfort, often contains valuable information. The feeling of being offended might be telling you something about your attachments or expectations. The experience of disappointment might be revealing unrealistic hopes. The sensation of hurt might be highlighting areas where you need stronger boundaries or better communication skills. Learning to sit with difficult emotions, to experience them fully without being controlled by them, is like developing emotional core strength. It allows you to remain stable and centered, even when life becomes turbulent. This doesn't mean suppressing emotions or pretending they don't matter. It means developing the capacity to feel your feelings while also maintaining perspective on them. One practical way to build this tolerance is through what I call emotional weightlifting. When you notice yourself having a strong emotional reaction to something relatively minor, someone cuts you off in traffic, a friend doesn't return your call immediately, a colleague makes a dismissive comment, use it as an opportunity to practice resilience. Instead of automatically reacting, pause and see how long you can sit with the emotion without acting on it impulsively. Resilience also grows through the practice of self-compassion. Many people believe that being hard on themselves will make them stronger, but research shows the opposite is true. When you treat yourself with kindness during difficult times, you actually recover faster and become more resilient to future challenges. The Stoics understood this. They advocated for rational self-examination, not self-punishment. When you make a mistake or handle a situation poorly, instead of engaging in harsh self-criticism, try approaching yourself the way a wise, compassionate mentor would. Ask, what can I learn from this? How can I handle similar situations better in the future? What does this experience teach me about my current limitations and areas for growth? Building resilience is also about developing a long-term perspective. When you're in the middle of a painful experience, it can feel like it will last forever. But resilient people understand that emotions are temporary, situations change, and growth often comes from the experiences that initially seem most difficult. The Stoics practiced this long-term thinking by regularly contemplating the temporary nature of all circumstances. They would remind themselves that current difficulties are temporary, but the strength and wisdom gained from handling those difficulties can last a lifetime. This perspective doesn't minimize genuine pain, but it provides hope and context during challenging times. Perhaps most importantly, resilience is built through community and connection. The Stoics weren't isolated individuals trying to tough it out alone. They were part of a philosophical community that supported each other's growth and development. Modern research confirms what the Stoics understood. Resilience is easier to develop and maintain when you have supportive relationships and a sense of belonging. As you work to build emotional resilience, remember that it's not about becoming invulnerable or never feeling hurt. It's about developing the capacity to move through difficult experiences with grace, to learn from setbacks, and to emerge from challenges stronger and wiser than before. Each time you choose growth over victimhood, perspective over offense, you're building the kind of inner strength that no external circumstance can take away from you. There's a story about two people looking out the same window. One sees mud, the other sees stars. The window hasn't changed, the view is identical, but their experience is completely different. This simple metaphor captures one of the most powerful tools the Stoics developed for maintaining emotional equilibrium and preventing offense: the deliberate cultivation of gratitude. Gratitude isn't just a nice feeling or a polite social convention. It's a profound practice that literally rewires your brain to notice what's working rather than what's missing, what's beautiful rather than what's broken, what's possible rather than what's painful. When you train your attention to focus on what you appreciate in your life, you create a psychological buffer against the inevitable disappointments and offenses that life brings. The Stoics understood that gratitude and offense cannot coexist in the same mental space. When you're genuinely appreciating what you have, it's almost impossible to simultaneously feel victimized by what you lack. When you're focused on the gifts present in your life, you're less likely to be derailed by temporary setbacks or other people's poor behavior. Let me tell you about Jennifer, a nurse who worked in a particularly challenging hospital environment. The staff was overworked, management was often unsupportive, and patients and families frequently took their stress and fear out on the medical team. Jennifer found herself constantly feeling offended by patients' complaints, hurt by colleagues' criticism, and resentful about working conditions that seemed to get worse rather than better. Jennifer was on the verge of leaving nursing entirely when she encountered Stoic philosophy and decided to experiment with a daily gratitude practice. Each morning before her shift, she would spend 5 minutes writing down 3 things she was grateful for. They could be anything from having hot coffee, to a patient's recovery, to a colleague's small act of kindness. Initially, this practice felt forced and artificial. When you're focused on everything that's wrong, it can be difficult to notice what's right. But Jennifer persisted, and gradually something began to shift. She started noticing positive interactions she had previously overlooked. She began to appreciate the meaningful nature of her work in ways she had forgotten. She found herself feeling more patient with difficult patients, because she was more aware of the privilege of being able to help during their vulnerable moments. The transformation wasn't immediate or dramatic, but it was real. Jennifer still faced the same challenging working conditions, still encountered difficult patients and unsupportive management. But her experience of these challenges changed fundamentally. Instead of feeling constantly under attack, she began to see her work as an opportunity to practice compassion, patience, and skill. Instead of taking every criticism personally, she started viewing feedback as information that could help her improve her patient care. The Stoics practiced what they called amor fati, love of fate. This doesn't mean pretending that difficult experiences are pleasant, but rather finding ways to appreciate even challenging circumstances for what they teach you or how they contribute to your growth. Marcus Aurelius exemplified this when he wrote, "Confine yourself to the present," and then found ways to appreciate even the difficulties of ruling an empire during times of plague and war. This practice of finding gratitude even in difficult circumstances is particularly powerful for dealing with offense. When someone says something hurtful to you, instead of immediately focusing on the pain of their words, you can practice looking for something to appreciate in the situation. Perhaps you're grateful for the opportunity to practice patience. Maybe you appreciate learning something about this person's character or stress level. You might be thankful for the chance to demonstrate grace under pressure. This doesn't mean becoming a doormat or accepting mistreatment passively. You can appreciate the learning opportunity while still setting appropriate boundaries. You can be grateful for insights about someone's character while also choosing to limit your interactions with them. Gratitude and appropriate action aren't mutually exclusive. One of the most profound aspects of gratitude practice is how it changes your relationship with expectations. Much of our experience of offense comes from unmet expectations. We expect people to be more considerate, situations to be more fair, life to be more predictable. When reality doesn't match these expectations, we feel disappointed and often offended. But regular gratitude practice helps you appreciate what is rather than lamenting what isn't. When you're genuinely grateful for the kindness you do receive, you're less likely to be devastated by occasional rudeness. When you appreciate the things that go smoothly in your day, you're more resilient when facing unexpected challenges. The Stoics also understood that gratitude is most powerful when it's specific and concrete rather than general and abstract. Instead of thinking, "I'm grateful for my health," you might appreciate, "I'm grateful that my body allowed me to walk in the sunshine today." Instead of, "I'm grateful for my family," you might focus on, "I'm grateful for the way my partner made me laugh at breakfast this morning." This specificity helps you notice the actual texture of your life rather than taking good things for granted. It's easy to overlook small kindnesses, minor conveniences, and everyday pleasures when you're focused on larger problems or disappointments. But these small positive experiences often make up the majority of your daily life, and appreciating them can dramatically shift your overall sense of well-being. Another powerful gratitude practice is what I call gratitude for challenges. This involves finding ways to appreciate difficult experiences for what they teach you or how they help you grow. The person who criticizes you harshly might be helping you develop emotional resilience. The situation that doesn't go according to plan might be teaching you flexibility and adaptability. The relationship that ends might be freeing you to find a better connection. This isn't about pretending that painful experiences aren't painful or that harmful behavior is acceptable. It's about finding ways to extract value and meaning from inevitable difficulties rather than simply enduring them with resentment. Seneca captured this beautifully when he wrote about the value of setbacks. Every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end. He understood that what appears to be loss or failure often creates space for growth and new opportunities. When you can find genuine gratitude for how challenges contribute to your development, you become much less vulnerable to feeling victimized by them. The practice of gratitude also extends to appreciating other people's perspectives, even when they differ from your own. When someone disagrees with you or offers criticism, instead of immediately feeling defensive, you can practice being grateful for the opportunity to see a different viewpoint. This doesn't mean automatically accepting every opinion, but it does mean appreciating the chance to expand your understanding or test your assumptions. Research in positive psychology has confirmed what the Stoics understood intuitively. Regular gratitude practice literally changes your brain. It strengthens neural pathways associated with positive emotions and weakens pathways associated with negativity and complaint. Over time, this makes it easier to notice what's working and harder to get stuck in patterns of resentment and offense. But perhaps the most beautiful aspect of gratitude practice is how it naturally leads to what the Stoics called sympathia, the recognition of our interconnectedness with all life. When you regularly appreciate the countless ways that other people's efforts contribute to your well-being, from the farmers who grow your food, to the engineers who design your transportation, to the scientists who develop your medicine, you begin to see yourself as part of a vast web of mutual support and cooperation. This expanded perspective makes it much harder to take things personally or to feel constantly under attack. When you recognize how much goodness and generosity already exist in your life, temporary rudeness or inconsideration from others seems much less significant. You realize that the vast majority of people you encounter each day are either neutral toward you or actively contributing to your well-being in ways you might not even notice. As you develop your gratitude practice, start simply. Each day, notice 3 specific things you're grateful for. They don't have to be profound or life-changing. Small appreciations are often more powerful than grand gestures of thankfulness. Over time, you'll find that this practice naturally expands, and you'll begin to notice positive aspects of your experience that you previously overlooked. Remember, gratitude isn't about denial or toxic positivity. It's about balance, learning to appreciate what's working while still being realistic about what needs attention or change. When you master this balance, you discover that gratitude becomes not just a practice, but a way of being in the world that makes you virtually offense-proof. There comes a moment in every person's journey toward wisdom when they realize that the question isn't whether life will present challenges, disappointments, or offensive behavior. It's whether you'll meet these inevitable experiences from a place of purpose and inner peace, or from a place of reactivity and emotional chaos. The Stoics understood that the difference between these 2 approaches isn't just about feeling better in the moment. It's about the fundamental difference between living a meaningful life and merely surviving a series of emotional reactions. When you live with genuine purpose, when your actions align with your deepest values and your energy is directed toward what truly matters, the small slights and offenses that once derailed your peace begin to seem almost insignificant. Not because they don't matter at all, but because you have something more important to focus on: the cultivation of wisdom, the practice of virtue, and the contribution you want to make to the world. Marcus Aurelius exemplified this approach. As the most powerful man in the Roman Empire, he could have spent his time feeling offended by the constant criticism, betrayal, and political maneuvering that surrounded him. Instead, he chose to focus on what he could control: his own character, his decisions, and his commitment to serving the common good. His personal writings reveal a man who found deep peace not by avoiding difficulties, but by aligning his daily actions with his highest principles. Let me share the story of Robert, a teacher who discovered this truth through a profound shift in how he approached his work and life. Robert had spent years feeling constantly frustrated and offended by his students' disrespectful behavior, parents' unrealistic demands, and administrators' seemingly arbitrary decisions. He took every challenge personally, interpreting each criticism as an attack on his competence and every student's misbehavior as a reflection of his failure as an educator. Robert was considering leaving teaching entirely when he had what he later described as a life-changing realization. Sitting in his empty classroom after a particularly difficult day, he asked himself a simple question: what if none of this is actually about me? This question opened up a completely different way of thinking about his role and purpose. Robert began to see that his students' behavior was usually a reflection of their own struggles, family situations, and developmental challenges, rather than a judgment of his worth as a teacher. Parents' demands often came from their deep love for their children and anxiety about their futures, rather than from disrespect for him personally. Administrative decisions were usually based on complex factors he wasn't aware of, rather than deliberate attempts to make his life difficult. But more importantly, Robert remembered why he had become a teacher in the first place: to help young people learn, grow, and discover their potential. When he refocused on this purpose, everything else began to feel less important. He still addressed inappropriate behavior and advocated for better working conditions, but he did so from a place of clarity and commitment, rather than from wounded ego and personal offense. This shift transformed not only Robert's experience of teaching, but his entire approach to life. He developed what the Stoics called the discipline of action, the practice of focusing your energy on what you can control and what serves your highest purpose, rather than dissipating it on reactions to things beyond your influence. The Stoics taught that purpose isn't something you find, it's something you choose. And once you choose it, you can return to it again and again, especially when life becomes challenging or confusing. Your purpose becomes like a North Star, a fixed point of reference that helps you navigate through storms without losing your way. Living with purpose requires what the Stoics called the view from above, the ability to see your individual experiences within a larger context of meaning and contribution. When you're operating from this expanded perspective, temporary setbacks and interpersonal conflicts begin to seem much less significant. You're playing a longer game, working toward larger goals, contributing to something greater than your immediate comfort or ego satisfaction. This doesn't mean becoming indifferent to your immediate experience or accepting harmful treatment passively. It means having a framework of meaning that helps you respond to challenges wisely rather than reactively. When someone criticizes your work, instead of feeling personally attacked, you can ask, when someone criticizes your work, instead of feeling personally attacked, you can ask, how does this feedback serve my larger purpose? What can I learn that will help me contribute more effectively? When you encounter rudeness or inconsideration, instead of taking it personally, you can remember that your purpose is to embody the qualities you want to see in the world, regardless of how others choose to behave. The Stoics also understood that inner peace isn't a destination you reach once and then maintain effortlessly. It's a practice you return to moment by moment, choice by choice. Peace isn't the absence of challenges, it's the presence of wisdom in how you meet those challenges. It's not about creating a life free from offense. It's about developing a character that remains unshaken by the inevitable storms of human interaction. Inner peace, from a Stoic perspective, comes from what they called ataraxia, a state of serene calmness that arises when you stop fighting reality and start working skillfully with whatever arises. This doesn't mean becoming passive or resigned. It means developing such a strong sense of your own values and purpose that external events can't knock you off course for long. Consider the story of Sarah, a non-profit director who discovered this truth during one of the most challenging periods of her career. Her organization was facing funding cuts, staff departures, and public criticism of their programs. Board members were questioning her leadership, donors were pulling their support, and the media was running negative stories about the organization's effectiveness. Initially, Sarah felt devastated and personally attacked. She took every criticism as evidence that she was failing, every funding loss as a rejection of her worth, every staff departure as a betrayal. She spent sleepless nights replaying conversations and crafting defensive responses to critics. The stress was affecting her health, her relationships, and her ability to lead effectively. But gradually, Sarah began to apply Stoic principles to her situation. She started by reconnecting with her core purpose, helping vulnerable populations in her community. She reminded herself that this purpose was more important than her ego, her reputation, or even her job security. From this grounded place, she could see that many of the criticisms contained valid points that could help improve the organization's effectiveness. Instead of feeling offended by feedback, Sarah began to welcome it as information that could help her serve her mission better. Instead of taking funding challenges personally, she saw them as problems to solve creatively. Instead of interpreting staff departures as betrayals, she recognized that people have different career needs and that her job was to support their growth even when it meant they would leave. This shift in perspective didn't immediately solve all the organization's problems, but it completely transformed Sarah's experience of leading through crisis. She found that when she stopped wasting energy on feeling offended and started channeling that energy into purposeful action, she became much more effective as a leader. Her calmness and clarity inspired confidence in others, and gradually the organization not only survived the crisis, but emerged stronger. The Stoics taught that this kind of inner peace is available to everyone, regardless of external circumstances. Epictetus, who spent years as a slave before becoming a respected teacher, understood that freedom is fundamentally an internal condition. You can be physically constrained but mentally free, or physically free but mentally enslaved by your reactions to other people's behavior. Living with purpose and inner peace also requires what the Stoics called preferred indifference, the recognition that while you may prefer certain outcomes, your happiness and peace don't depend on getting those preferences met. You might prefer that people treat you with respect, but you don't need their respect to maintain your dignity. You might prefer that situations go smoothly, but you don't need smooth circumstances to remain centered and purposeful. This practice of holding preferences lightly while remaining committed to your values and purpose is incredibly liberating. It means you can work toward positive outcomes without being devastated when things don't go according to plan. You can hope for the best while being prepared to respond wisely to whatever actually occurs. Another crucial aspect of living with purpose is understanding that your primary responsibility is to your own character development, not to controlling other people's behavior. The Stoics taught that you are the author of your own life story, and the quality of that story depends on the choices you make, not on the circumstances you encounter or the way others treat you. This perspective transforms offense from a personal injury into an opportunity for character development. When someone is rude to you, you have the chance to practice patience and compassion. When someone criticizes you unfairly, you can demonstrate grace under pressure. When someone betrays your trust, you can choose wisdom over vengeance and learn to set better boundaries in the future. Marcus Aurelius captured this beautifully when he wrote, "Confine yourself to the present." He understood that peace is always available in this moment, regardless of what happened yesterday or what might happen tomorrow. When you bring your full attention to your present moment choices, how you want to respond, what values you want to embody, what purpose you want to serve, you discover that you have everything you need to live with dignity and peace. The practice of living with purpose and inner peace also naturally leads to what the Stoics called sympathia, the recognition of our fundamental interconnectedness with all life. When you're secure in your own purpose and values, you can see that everyone else is also trying to navigate life as best they can with the understanding and resources they currently have. This perspective makes it much easier to respond to difficult behavior with compassion rather than offense. As we conclude this exploration of Stoic practice, remember that these aren't just philosophical concepts to think about. They're ways of being to practice and embody. Each moment offers you the opportunity to choose wisdom over reactivity, purpose over ego protection, inner peace over external validation. The goal isn't to become a perfect Stoic sage who never feels hurt or disappointment. The goal is to develop the capacity to feel your emotions fully while also maintaining perspective on them, to encounter challenges without being defined by them, and to live with such a strong sense of purpose that temporary setbacks can't derail your commitment to wisdom and virtue. When you live this way, you discover something remarkable. Offense becomes optional. Not because you become indifferent to how others treat you, but because you become so centered in your own values and purpose that other people's behavior can't shake your fundamental sense of peace and dignity. You realize that your worth isn't determined by external validation. Your peace isn't dependent on favorable circumstances, and your purpose isn't diminished by temporary obstacles. This is the promise of Stoic philosophy, not that life becomes easy, but that you become unshakable. Not that others will always treat you well, but that you can maintain your integrity regardless of how they choose to behave. Not that you'll never feel hurt, but that you'll never be destroyed by that hurt. In discovering that offense is optional, you discover something even more profound, that freedom, peace, and dignity are always available to you, no matter what storms may rage in the external world. This is the ultimate gift of Stoic wisdom, the recognition that everything you need for a meaningful, peaceful life already exists within you, waiting to be claimed through the daily practice of wisdom, virtue, and conscious choice. There's a moment in every person's journey toward wisdom when life presents what feels like the ultimate test, a situation so challenging, so personally threatening, so offensive to everything you hold dear that it strips away all pretense and reveals who you truly are beneath all your philosophical learning. For most of us, this moment arrives not as a dramatic catastrophe, but as an ordinary situation that somehow manages to push every button we didn't even know we still had. This is the story of that moment in your journey, the moment when everything you've learned about Stoicism, about non-reactivity, about the optional nature of offense, gets put to the most rigorous test life can devise. It's the moment when you discover whether your wisdom is merely intellectual understanding or has truly become part of who you are. Picture yourself 6 months from now, having practiced these Stoic principles consistently. You've developed the habit of pausing before reacting. You've learned to distinguish between what's in your control and what isn't. You've cultivated gratitude, acceptance, and emotional resilience. You've begun to live with greater purpose and inner peace. You feel confident that you've moved beyond the person who used to get offended by every slight, real or imagined. Then it happens. The situation that will test everything you've learned arrives without warning, as these tests always do. Perhaps it's a public humiliation at work. A colleague takes credit for your idea in front of senior management, and then goes further, suggesting that you've been struggling with your responsibilities. Maybe it's a betrayal by someone you trusted deeply. A close friend spreads private information you shared in confidence, information that damages your reputation and hurts people you care about. Or it could be a family member who launches into a vicious personal attack during what was supposed to be a peaceful gathering, saying things so cruel and untrue that they seem designed specifically to destroy your sense of self-worth. In that moment, every cell in your body screams for retaliation. Your heart races, your face flushes, and that familiar cocktail of anger, hurt, and indignation floods your system. The old you would have reacted immediately, defending, attacking, or retreating into wounded silence. But you've been training for this moment, even though you didn't know it was coming. Let me tell you about Michael, whose test came during what should have been the pinnacle of his career. Michael had spent 2 years developing an innovative program for his company, working nights and weekends, pouring his creativity and passion into something he believed could make a real difference. The program was finally ready for presentation to the board of directors, and Michael was confident it would be well received. But during the presentation, his manager, Susan, systematically dismantled his work. She questioned his research, criticized his methodology, and suggested that the program was poorly conceived and potentially harmful to the company. She then presented an alternative proposal, one that Michael recognized as a modified version of his own idea, repackaged and presented as Susan's original thinking. The board, influenced by Susan's authority and presentation skills, rejected Michael's proposal and approved hers. Not only had Michael's work been stolen, but he had been made to look incompetent in front of the people who determined his future at the company. Several board members exchanged glances that suggested they were questioning his judgment and capabilities. As Michael sat there, watching his professional reputation crumble and his work be credited to someone else, he felt the familiar surge of everything he had once identified as righteous anger. Every instinct screamed at him to defend himself, to expose Susan's theft, to fight back with everything he had. The old Michael would have done exactly that, probably in a way that would have destroyed his career even more completely. But something different happened. In the midst of his emotional storm, Michael found the pause he had been practicing. In that pause, he remembered the fundamental Stoic insight that had become his anchor. This situation, however unfair, however painful, could only damage him if he allowed it to. His worth as a person didn't depend on receiving credit for his work. His integrity didn't require external validation. His peace of mind didn't have to be hostage to Susan's choices. This didn't mean Michael felt nothing. He experienced the full weight of disappointment, anger, and hurt. But he also experienced something new, the ability to feel these emotions without being controlled by them. He could acknowledge the injustice without being consumed by indignation. He could recognize the betrayal without letting it define his sense of self. Instead of reacting defensively or aggressively, Michael chose a response that surprised everyone, including himself. He thanked the board for their time and consideration, acknowledged that Susan's alternative proposal had merit, and expressed his commitment to supporting whatever direction the company chose to pursue. He said this calmly, with genuine dignity, without a trace of sarcasm or passive-aggressive undertone. The immediate result was that Michael maintained his professional reputation and relationships. But the deeper result was that he had passed his own test. He had proven to himself that his Stoic practice wasn't just philosophical theory, it had become part of his character. He had demonstrated that he could remain centered and purposeful, even when facing significant injustice and personal attack. This doesn't mean Michael became a doormat or that he accepted the situation passively. Over the following weeks, he quietly documented what had happened and eventually brought the matter to higher management through appropriate channels. Susan's pattern of taking credit for others' work was exposed, and she faced professional consequences. But Michael's response came from a place of clear thinking and principled action rather than emotional reactivity and personal vendetta. Your test might look different from Michael's, but it will share certain characteristics. It will feel intensely personal. It will seem to threaten something you care deeply about. It will trigger every defensive mechanism you've developed over a lifetime. And it will offer you a choice. React from your old patterns of offense and reactivity, or respond from the wisdom and strength you've been cultivating. The beautiful thing about these tests is that they often come when you're ready for them, even though you don't feel ready. Your months of practice, all those small moments when you chose perspective over offense, acceptance over resistance, purpose over ego, have been preparing you for this larger challenge. You've been building emotional muscle, and now you get to discover how strong you've become. In that crucial moment, you'll remember that offense is optional. You'll recall that other people's behavior says more about them than about you. You'll recognize that your worth doesn't depend on external validation or fair treatment. You'll understand that your primary responsibility is to your own character and choices, not to controlling others or ensuring that justice is immediately served. But perhaps most importantly, you'll discover that you can handle much more than you thought possible. You'll learn that you can feel hurt without being destroyed, experience injustice without becoming bitter, face betrayal without losing your capacity for trust. You'll realize that your inner peace is more robust than you imagined, your sense of purpose more resilient than you knew. The test will pass, as all tests do, but what remains is the knowledge that you've been fundamentally transformed. You've moved from someone who could be easily offended and derailed to someone who can maintain dignity and clarity even under extreme pressure. You've discovered that Stoic principles aren't just nice ideas. They're practical tools that actually work when life becomes challenging. This transformation doesn't make you immune to future difficulties or guarantee that you'll handle every situation perfectly. But it does give you unshakable confidence that you have the resources to meet whatever comes with wisdom and strength. You've proven to yourself that offense truly is optional, and that freedom opens up possibilities for living that you're only beginning to explore. As you reflect on your test, whatever form it takes, remember that it's not really about the external situation or the other people involved. It's about discovering who you choose to be when everything is stripped away, except your ability to choose your response. And in that choice lies all your power, all your freedom, and all your peace. There's a moment that comes to every person who has deeply internalized Stoic wisdom, a moment of profound recognition that feels like waking up from a dream you didn't realize you were having. It's the moment when you truly understand, not just intellectually, but in your bones, that offense has been optional all along. That all those years of feeling hurt, angry, and victimized by other people's words and actions were the result of a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of your own mind and the source of your peace. This awakening doesn't happen all at once, like a lightning bolt of enlightenment. It emerges gradually, through the accumulation of countless small moments when you chose wisdom over reactivity, acceptance over resistance, purpose over ego protection. And then, suddenly, you realize that something fundamental has shifted. You've moved beyond the possibility of being offended in any lasting way. This isn't because you've become emotionally numb or indifferent to how others treat you. You still feel the full spectrum of human emotions. You still prefer kindness to cruelty, respect to dismissal, truth to deception. But you've discovered something extraordinary. Your inner peace no longer depends on getting these preferences met. Your sense of worth no longer fluctuates based on external validation. Your happiness no longer requires the world to conform to your expectations. Let me share the story of Elena, whose moment of awakening came during what should have been one of the most stressful periods of her life. Elena had been practicing Stoic principles for nearly 2 years when she faced a perfect storm of challenges. Her elderly mother was diagnosed with dementia, requiring Elena to become her primary caregiver while managing her own demanding career. Her teenage daughter was going through a rebellious phase that included harsh criticism of Elena's parenting, and her marriage was strained to the breaking point by the stress of these combined pressures. In the past, any one of these situations would have been enough to send Eleanor into an emotional tailspin. The combination would have been devastating. But as Eleanor navigated this difficult period, she made a remarkable discovery. She could be fully present to the pain and challenge of each situation without being overwhelmed by it. She could feel sadness about her mother's condition without despair. She could hear her daughter's criticism without taking it as a personal indictment. She could acknowledge the strain in her marriage without panic or blame. More surprisingly, Eleanor found herself responding to each challenge with a clarity and compassion that amazed her. When her mother became confused and accused Eleanor of stealing from her, instead of feeling hurt and defensive, Eleanor felt only compassion for her mother's fear and confusion. When her daughter screamed that Eleanor was the worst mother ever, instead of feeling wounded and angry, Eleanor saw a young person struggling with changes she couldn't control. When her husband snapped at her over a minor household issue, instead of taking it personally, Eleanor recognized someone at the end of his emotional rope who needed support rather than conflict. This wasn't denial or suppression of difficult emotions. Eleanor felt all of it: the grief, the frustration, the exhaustion, the fear. But she also maintained what the Stoics called the view from above, a perspective that allowed her to see these experiences as part of the human condition rather than as personal attacks on her worth or peace. The breakthrough moment came during a particularly difficult evening. Eleanor's mother had been especially confused and agitated all day. Her daughter had gotten in trouble at school and blamed Eleanor for never being there, and her husband had announced that he was considering a separation because he couldn't handle this anymore. Any reasonable person would have felt overwhelmed and devastated. But as Eleanor sat alone in her kitchen that night, absorbing the full weight of these challenges, something extraordinary happened. Instead of feeling victimized or defeated, she felt a profound sense of peace. Not happiness. The circumstances were genuinely difficult, but peace. She realized that her worth as a person, her capacity for love and wisdom, her fundamental okayness wasn't threatened by any of these external circumstances. In that moment, Eleanor understood what Marcus Aurelius meant when he wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." Realize this, and you will find strength. She had found that power, and with it came a freedom she had never imagined possible. This freedom didn't solve Elena's practical problems, but it completely transformed her experience of dealing with them. She approached each challenge from a place of centeredness rather than reactivity, wisdom rather than emotion, purpose rather than self-protection. The solutions she found were more creative and effective because they came from clarity rather than chaos. The Stoics called this state ataraxia, unshakable tranquility. It's not the absence of challenges or emotions, but the presence of an inner stability that remains constant regardless of external circumstances. It's the recognition that you are not your thoughts, not your emotions, not your circumstances, but the conscious awareness that can observe all of these without being defined by them. When you reach this level of understanding, offense becomes literally impossible in any sustained way. You might feel a momentary flash of irritation when someone is rude, but it doesn't stick. You might notice disappointment when things don't go as planned, but it doesn't derail you. You might experience sadness when relationships end or change, but it doesn't devastate you. This transformation happens because you've internalized the most profound Stoic insight, that your experience of life is determined not by what happens to you, but by your thoughts about what happens to you. And since you have the power to choose your thoughts, not always easily, not always immediately, but ultimately, you have the power to choose your experience. This doesn't mean you can think your way out of genuine grief or legitimate pain. Some emotions are natural and healthy responses to difficult circumstances. But you can choose not to compound that natural pain with additional suffering created by your interpretations, expectations, and demands about how life should be different. The person who has moved beyond offense has learned to distinguish between pain and suffering, between feeling emotions and being enslaved by them, between responding to challenges and reacting to them. They've developed what might be called emotional sovereignty, the ability to feel whatever arises without losing their center, their purpose, or their peace. This level of mastery also brings with it a profound compassion for others who are still caught in patterns of reactivity and offense. When you understand how much unnecessary suffering comes from taking things personally and fighting reality, you naturally feel empathy for those who haven't yet discovered this freedom. You see their anger and attacks not as threats to your peace, but as expressions of their own pain and confusion. This compassion becomes a natural response rather than a forced moral choice. When someone is rude to you, instead of feeling offended, you might wonder what's troubling them. When someone criticizes you harshly, instead of feeling defensive, you might look for any useful feedback, while also recognizing that their delivery says more about their emotional state than about your worth. The enlightened understanding of Stoicism also reveals the interconnectedness of all human experience. You begin to see that everyone is doing their best with their current level of understanding and resources. This doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it helps you respond to it with wisdom rather than reactivity. Perhaps most beautifully, moving beyond offense opens up enormous amounts of mental and emotional energy that was previously consumed by taking things personally and fighting with reality. This energy becomes available for creativity, contribution, love, and growth. You discover that when you're not constantly defending yourself against perceived attacks, you have much more capacity for actually living. The person who has transcended offense doesn't become isolated or indifferent. Quite the opposite. They become more engaged with life, more present to others, more capable of genuine intimacy and connection. When you're not constantly worried about being hurt or disrespected, you can open your heart more fully to whatever experiences life offers. This is the ultimate promise of Stoic philosophy. Not that life becomes easy or that people always treat you well, but that you become unshakable in your peace, unassailable in your dignity, and unlimited in your capacity to respond to whatever arises with wisdom and grace. As you continue your own journey toward this freedom, remember that enlightenment isn't a destination you reach once and then possess forever. It's a deepening understanding that you return to again and again, each time with greater clarity and stability. Every moment offers you the opportunity to choose freedom over reactivity, peace over offense, wisdom over wounded ego. And in making these choices, moment by moment, day by day, you discover that the person you're becoming is someone you could never have imagined when you first began this journey, someone who is truly free. As we reach the end of this journey together, take a moment to consider how far you've traveled. When we began, you might have been someone who felt regularly wounded by other people's words and actions, who took criticism personally, who spent precious mental energy feeling offended by the countless small and large injustices of daily life. If you've truly engaged with these Stoic principles, you're no longer that person. You've discovered something that most people never learn. That offense is not something that happens to you, but something you participate in creating. You've learned that between every external event and your emotional response lies a space where your freedom resides. You've developed the capacity to pause, to choose your interpretation, to respond from wisdom rather than reactivity. This transformation isn't just about feeling better, though you certainly do feel better. It's about becoming free. Free from the tyranny of other people's moods and opinions. Free from the exhausting need to control how others treat you. Free from the constant vigilance required to protect a fragile ego from perceived attacks. But perhaps most importantly, you've learned that this freedom doesn't require the world to change. You don't need people to become more considerate, situations to become more fair, or life to become easier. Your peace is no longer hostage to external circumstances, and that changes everything. The Stoic path you've walked is not a one-time achievement, but an ongoing practice. There will be moments when you forget these insights and slip back into old patterns of reactivity. There will be situations that test your equanimity more severely than anything you've faced before. There will be times when you question whether this philosophy actually works when confronted with real challenges. These moments are not failures, they're opportunities to practice. Each time you catch yourself taking something personally and choose to see it differently, you strengthen your capacity for freedom. Each time you feel the familiar surge of offense and remember to pause, you deepen your wisdom. Each time you choose purpose over ego protection, you become more fully yourself. The life you're creating, a life free from offense, is not a life free from challenges, emotions, or difficulties. It's a life where you meet those inevitable experiences from a place of strength, wisdom, and inner peace. It's a life where other people's behavior can't derail your sense of purpose or destroy your emotional equilibrium. This freedom ripples out beyond your own experience. When you stop being offended by others' behavior, you create space for more authentic relationships. When you respond to criticism and conflict with wisdom rather than defensiveness, you model a different way of being that often inspires others to become less reactive themselves. When you maintain your peace, regardless of external circumstances, you become a source of stability and calm in a chaotic world. The ancient Stoics understood that philosophy is not merely an intellectual exercise, but a way of life. The principles you've learned, the dichotomy of control, the practice of non-reactivity, the cultivation of acceptance and gratitude, the commitment to living with purpose, these are not just ideas to think about, but ways of being to embody. As you continue forward, remember that mastery is not perfection. It's the ability to return to wisdom more quickly when you've lost your way. It's the capacity to learn from mistakes rather than being defeated by them. It's the recognition that growth is an ongoing process, not a final destination. You now possess tools that can serve you for the rest of your life. When someone's words trigger that familiar feeling of offense, you can pause and ask, "What if this isn't about me?" When circumstances don't unfold according to your preferences, you can practice acceptance while taking appropriate action. When life presents challenges, you can see them as opportunities to practice virtue and develop wisdom. The journey from offense to freedom is ultimately a journey from unconsciousness to consciousness, from reactivity to choice, from victimhood to empowerment. It's the recognition that while you cannot control what happens to you, you always have the power to choose what happens within you. And in that choice, made moment by moment, situation by situation, challenge by challenge, lies all the freedom, peace, and dignity any human being could ever need. This is the gift of Stoic wisdom, not the promise that life will be easy, but the assurance that you can meet whatever comes with grace, strength, and unshakable inner peace. The person reading these words is not the same person who began this journey. You have been transformed by understanding, strengthened by practice, and liberated by wisdom. The life that awaits you, a life where offense is optional and peace is always possible, is not just a beautiful ideal, but a lived reality that begins with your very next choice. Choose wisely, choose freely, choose peace.